Hello and welcome to Silent Echo. On a warm June night in Arkansas, a little girl walked away from the bleachers at a Little League game to chase fireflies with her friends. A few minutes later, the game ended. The lights were still on. Parents were still nearby. Cars were still parked where they had been parked all evening. But 6-year-old Morgan Nick was gone. That is the part of this case that has never loosened its grip on people. Morgan did not vanish on a mountain trail. She did not disappear in a storm. She was not last seen in deep woods or on open water or on some remote road after midnight. She was at a youth baseball game in Alma, Arkansas. There were children running around. There were families in lawn chairs and on bleachers. There was noise and routine, and all the ordinary comfort of a small-town summer night. And in the middle of that normal scene, a child seems to have been taken almost silently and almost instantly. For 3 decades, the disappearance of Morgan Nick has endured because it forces the mind into a simple sequence that never feels possible. Morgan was there. Morgan was close to her mother. Morgan was seen only yards away. Then she was not there. No one heard a scream that changed the night. No one stopped a truck leaving at high speed. No one found a shoe beside a ditch, or a shirt in the grass, or a trail leading into the dark. A place that should have been safe became the last known point in the life of a 6-year-old girl. And now, after years in which the case seemed to sit inside that terrible category of well-known but unsolved child abductions, investigators say they have a suspect. In October 2024, Alma police said DNA from a blonde hair recovered from a red truck strongly indicated that Morgan had been inside that vehicle. The truck belonged to Billy Jack Lincks. He had already drawn attention years earlier because about 2 months after Morgan disappeared, he attempted to abduct another young girl not far from the same ball field. Lincks died in prison in 2000. Morgan has still never been found. No one has ever stood trial taking her. And that means that even after one of the biggest breaks this case has ever seen, the central question remains exactly where it began. Where is Morgan Nick? That question is what makes this story so haunting, not because it invites fantasy, not because it needs exaggeration. This case does not need any of that. It is already as disturbing as any mystery can be. A child disappears in a public place from within sight of the adult who loves her most. Witnesses remember a man. A truck becomes important. Years pass. Evidence survives longer than memory. Science catches up to old suspicion. But the child does not come home. To understand why this case still hits so hard, you have to go back to the atmosphere of that night and the structure of the place where it happened. Because cases like this do not only survive on names and dates. They survive on setting. They survive on the difference between what a place promised and what it allowed. Wofford Baseball Field in Alma was the kind of place where families expected children to drift a little and then come back. The kind of place where a game stretched into the evening and the boundary between watching baseball and letting kids catch fireflies felt harmless. It was not wilderness, it was not chaos, it was a community event. And that is exactly why the case has never stopped feeling wrong. In the years since Morgan disappeared, the details of that summer night have been repeated so often that they can sound almost too familiar. A green Girl Scout shirt, denim shorts, white tennis shoes, blonde hair, blue eyes, 5 silver caps on her molars, a red pickup truck with a white camper shell, a white man with a mustache and a short beard, fireflies in the dark, sand in a child's shoes. Each detail is simple enough on its own. Put together, they form one of the clearest and most devastating last-seen images in any American missing child case. The facts that are publicly documented are narrow and brutal. On June 9, 1995, Morgan Nick was at the Little League game in Alma with her mother, Colleen. At about 10:45 that night, she was last seen near her mother's car after playing with other children and catching fireflies. Witnesses later described a man watching her and described a red pickup with a white camper shell parked nearby. Morgan vanished in that short interval between the end of childish play and the moment the adults expected the children to come back. Despite a massive investigation, thousands of leads and decades of work by local police, the FBI, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, she has never been recovered. Her case remains open. The pain of that absence has never really aged. It has only deepened. Every missing person case has a point where time changes texture. Before that point, everything still feels reversible. A child is late. A person took a wrong turn. Someone is not answering because they are bit or embarrassed or angry or just out of range. Then there is a shift. The missing person is no longer merely overdue. They are absent in a way the world cannot explain. Morgan's case reached that point almost immediately. There was no long interval of uncertainty. No one waited until morning to panic. The alarm began that same night, because the gap between where she should have been and where she was measured in a handful of minutes. That short window matters. It matters because it strips away so many comforting explanations. It leaves behind the core shape of the event. Morgan was not gone for hours before anyone looked for her. She was not one of those cases where a person could have quietly left the area on foot and built a large head start. The disappearance happened fast enough that the scene itself became part of the mystery. The lot, the cars, the children, the timing. The expectation that if a 6-year-old had simply wandered off, someone should have seen something. The expectation that if there had been a struggle, somebody would have heard it. The expectation that there was still enough light and enough activity for danger to reveal itself. It did not. That is where this story begins. Not with theories, not with suspects, not with the later breakthroughs in forensic science. It begins with a baseball field in the dark and a mother turning to look for her daughter and not finding her. Alma in June carries the kind of atmosphere that can make memory feel almost visual, even for people who were never there. A small Arkansas town at the edge of the Ozarks. Ball fields lit against the dark. Humid air holding the sound of the game. Children restless in the late innings. Fireflies beginning to appear in the spaces beyond the bleachers. It is the kind of setting that almost invites nostalgia until you remember what happened there. Then every ordinary detail turns against itself. That is one of the reasons Morgan's case has remained so powerful for so long. The setting is not abstract. It is specific in a way that viewers and parents and investigators can immediately understand. Almost anyone can imagine a child asking to go play for a minute while adults stay within sight. Almost anyone can imagine saying yes because the place feels contained and the night feels familiar. There are certain disappearances that become permanent because they happen in places people already recognize from their own lives. Morgan's abduction did not take place in a world that looked dangerous. It took place in a world that looked routine. Morgan was 6 years old. That age matters in this case because 6 is old enough to run with other children and feel independent for a few minutes, but far too young to understand the hidden geometry of adult risk. A 6-year-old can cross a parking lot. A 6-year-old can move from the bleachers to the edge of the field and back again. A 6-year-old can trust a grown-up who speaks softly or offers help, or simply acts like he belongs there. At the same time, 6 is young enough that the child is still anchored to the assumption that adults are nearby and that the world is structured around their safety. It is the age where childhood still expects rescue. Public descriptions of Morgan have stayed almost unchanged across the years because that is often what missing child investigations become. They turn a child into a list that has to survive longer than photographs can. 4 feet tall, about 55 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, 5 visible silver caps on her molars, last seen in a green Girl Scout shirt, blue denim shorts, and white tennis shoes. It is painful to hear a child described that way because it sounds less like biography and more like a desperate inventory. But in a case like this, those details matter. They are the pieces a stranger might remember. They are the fragments that could anchor a sighting or challenge a false one. They become the practical language of hope. The known timeline of that evening is straightforward until the final minutes. Morgan attended the game with her mother, Colleen. At some point, near the end of the evening, Morgan and other children were allowed to go catch fireflies. In some retellings, people use the phrase lightning bugs because that is how they are remembered across much of the South. The word choice does not change the feeling, little points of light in warm darkness. Kids moving around the edge of the field. A small moment of freedom at the end of a game. The image is so gentle that it feels almost designed to make what comes next unbearable. One of the most striking aspects of this case is that Morgan was not described as disappearing while far away from the adults. She was not last seen at the edge of town or near some wooded path. She was last seen near her mother's car. According to the Morgan Nick Foundation, she had stopped to empty sand from her shoes. That is such an ordinary child detail that it does something most evidence cannot do. It humanizes the final moment without ornament. It places Morgan not in abstraction but in motion. A little girl pausing because her shoes feel wrong. Her friends nearby, a game ending, a mother expecting to leave soon. That is the last stable image before the whole event fractures. This is also where the witness material becomes important. Public case information says witnesses observed a man watching Morgan while she played, and also saw a red Ford pickup with a white camper parked nearby. The truck description itself has always stood out because it is specific enough to feel tangible. A white camper shell, possibly damaged at the right rear, a shell that looked short for the truck, a short wheelbase, paint dulled by age, Arkansas plates believed. The man was described as white, around 6 feet tall, with a medium to solid build, a mustache, and a beard about an inch long, and was estimated to be somewhere between 23 and 38 years old at the time. Those details did not solve the case in 1995. But they did something important. They gave shape to a danger that had only briefly intersected with the scene. There is also a deeper reason the witness account matters. In many missing child cases, the first hours are clouded, because nobody can say with confidence whether a child wandered off or was taken. In Morgan's case, the suspicious man and the truck gave investigators an early reason to consider abduction as more than a possibility. That does not mean every witness recollection was perfect. Eyewitness memory is never perfect, especially around a routine public event that only becomes significant after the fact. But taken together, the accounts pushed the case toward a stranger abduction framework very early. And the terrifying thing about that framework is how quickly it fits the timeline. The game ends. The children come back. Morgan does not. At first, that kind of absence can still be mistaken for ordinary drift. Maybe she went to another set of bleachers. Maybe she is behind a car. Maybe she followed a friend. Maybe she is in the restroom. That is how these moments often begin. Not with certainty, but with a sequence of small checks. Look there. Ask them, call again, walk to the car, look underneath, turn around. Search the immediate edge of the place, because the brain still refuses the larger answer. Then the checks begin to multiply. The name is called louder. Other adults start asking where the child is. Children are questioned. Their answers are too vague or too simple because they are children and because none of them knew that they were witnessing the last moment before a lifetime of not knowing. For Colleen Nick, that shift from ordinary concern to immediate terror has defined the case ever since. Public accounts describe her realizing Morgan was gone as the beginning of a search that never really ended. That is one of the central emotional truths of this story. Many missing person cases continue in files and databases and periodic searches. Morgan's case also continued in the body and voice of her mother. That matters not only because it shaped public memory, but because it shaped what the case became in Arkansas and beyond. But before all of that came the first nightmare version of the night itself. A ball field becoming a search scene. Families no longer spectators but witnesses. A child's brief game with fireflies transformed into the opening of one of the most heartbreaking abduction cases in the country. The first search in a case like this is not really a search in the formal sense. It is a denial ritual before it becomes an investigation. Adults look in the places that would preserve normality. Behind the bleachers, near the concession area, around the cars, along the edge of the field where children had been playing. Someone checks the most obvious places twice because the cost of accepting the alternative is too high. That is likely why the first minutes of Morgan's disappearance are so horrifying. There was almost no room for gradual disbelief. A 6-year-old cannot simply dissolve into a crowd at a local Little League game. The setting itself argues against innocence. This is where the structure of the ball field, part of the case. It was not a wilderness corridor. It was a bounded public space, shaped by paths, cars, parents, and children. In an open public environment, a missing child should create some kind of trace. Someone should see the child walking away. Someone should see an unfamiliar adult guiding her. Someone should hear a cry or notice a vehicle leaving at the wrong time. The lack of that clear trace is one of the reasons this case has continued to disturb people decades later. It suggests either terrifying speed or terrifying composure on the part of the abductor. A child can be taken quickly when the offender understands exactly how to exploit the gap between visibility and attention. That gap is larger than people like to admit. In everyday life, being seen is not the same as being actively watched. A public place creates the illusion of safety because many eyes are present. But most of those eyes are busy. They glance. They do not monitor. They register silhouettes. They do not read danger. A child near a car in a parking lot does not stand out. A truck idling near a ball field does not stand out. An adult speaking to a child may not stand out at all if the exchange lasts only seconds and if the adult appears calm. That may be one of the darkest lessons of Morgan's disappearance. Dangerous acts do not always look dramatic in real time. A child abduction in a public place does not necessarily resemble the versions people imagine. It may not involve obvious force. It may involve deception. It may involve a quick grab, hidden by angle and motion. It may involve a child being told that her mother needs help, or that she dropped something, or that someone has a question. The point is not to invent a scenario. We do not know exactly how Morgan was taken. The point is to understand why no one stopped it. Public places contain blind spots built out of assumption. That is one reason the red truck has remained so central. Vehicles create movement without spectacle. They convert a human event into a mechanical exit. A child can go from visible to unreachable in seconds once a door closes. By the time anyone understands that something is wrong, the vehicle is no longer just nearby. It is already part of the landscape beyond the scene. In 1995, that problem was even more severe. There were no smartphones filming the lot, no network of doorbell cameras, no automatic license plate readers preserving every passing vehicle. Once a truck left that area, it left mostly into human memory. And human memory is a fragile thing to build a criminal case on. Witnesses may notice the wrong detail or remember the right detail in the wrong order. They may combine separate moments into one. They may underestimate age or overestimate height. They may remember a color vividly and a face not at all. Yet in child abduction cases, investigators often have no choice but to begin there. In Morgan's case, witness memory gave law enforcement a man in a truck and a rough physical description. It did not give them enough to find Morgan that night. That gap between useful and insufficient is where so many long-term mysteries are born. The public record makes clear that the investigation was massive and that it generated thousands of leads. For families of missing children, that phrase can sound reassuring from a distance. Thousands of leads, countless tips, a huge response. But anyone who has studied these cases knows that volume can also be its own form of torment. Thousands of leads can mean thousands of false hopes. Thousands of tips can produce noise as easily as truth. The first challenge is finding the child. The second challenge is finding signal inside panic. Every caller believes they may hold the one detail that matters. Most do not. Some almost do. A few may come too late to matter. The absence of immediate physical evidence also shaped the case. Publicly available information about Morgan's disappearance does not include any recovered item from the scene that explains where she went. No confirmed trail, no clothing found nearby, no body recovered in the area. No forensic scene in the common sense of the word. That absence matters because it changed the type of investigation almost immediately. This was not a case where detectives could work backward from a crime scene in the traditional way. It was a case where they had to project outward from witness fragments and from the brutal logic that a child had likely been abducted by a stranger. That kind of case ages differently. It does not progress in a steady line. It stalls, it surges. It returns to old evidence as technology improves. It expands and narrows depending on witness credibility and on whether physical items from long ago still exist. Sometimes a case like that is small by confession, sometimes by a body, sometimes by an unrelated arrest that suddenly reorders the past, and sometimes it remains suspended in a state that is both more informed and no less painful. That is, the state Morgan's case would inhabit for years. What happened in those first hours matters, because every year that followed grew out of them. The alarm was immediate. The fear was immediate. The understanding that this was probably not a simple lost child incident was immediate. But immediate panic does not guarantee immediate answers. Sometimes it only guarantees that the moment of loss will stay sharp forever. And in Morgan's case, it did. Because the image that survived was impossible to shake. A little girl at a baseball field. Fireflies in the dark. A short walk to a car. Sand in her shoes. Then nothing. One reason Morgan's disappearance never faded into the background is that the case never settled into a tidy story. There was no clean resolution to mourn and no final certainty to process. Instead, the family was forced into the long, unnatural life of a missing child case. That life is built on repetition, repeating the description, repeating the date, repeating the clothes, repeating the last known moment until it becomes both sacred and unbearable. Every birthday becomes an accounting. Every public appeal becomes a reliving. Every possible sighting becomes a test of hope against caution. In most crimes, time eventually creates a form of distance, even when it does not bring peace. In missing child cases, time often does the opposite. It enlarges the absence. Morgan did not remain 6 in the life of the people who loved her. The world kept moving her forward. There were age progressions. There were imagined graduations and adult birthdays and ordinary milestones she never reached inside public view. The question was no longer only what happened on June 9, 1995. It became what happened after. Did she survive the night? Did she live long enough to remember her mother's face? Was she moved across counties or states? Was she hidden under another name? Did somebody somewhere know and stay silent? Those are painful questions because most of them cannot be answered by publicly documented evidence. They live in the space left open by the lack of recovery. And that lack changes everything. When there is no body, and no confession, and no trial, the family is forced to live between categories. They are denied the absolute closure of death, but also denied the practical hope of rescue. They exist in a narrow and cruel territory where every year without contact becomes harder to interpret. Morgan's mother has spoken publicly about holding on to the possibility that some missing children survive. That small percentage became more than a statistic. It became a reason not to stop, a reason to keep speaking her daughter's name in a world that keeps trying to move on. Colleen Nick did more than keep speaking it. Over the years, she became one of the most visible and influential advocates for missing children in the United States. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has described how she became a longtime advocate and board member and helped start Team Hope with Patty Wetterling. The Morgan Nick Foundation grew out of this loss and became a support network for families, a support network for missing children and adults in Arkansas. In other words, the disappearance did not only produce grief, it produced infrastructure. It changed how support and prevention were imagined in the state. Arkansas even names its missing child alert system the Morgan Nick Amber Alert. That legacy is real and important. But it also carries one of the most painful contradictions in the case. Morgan's name helped build systems designed to save other children before she herself could be found. There is something profoundly sad about that kind of legacy, necessary and admirable and deeply sad. It means one child became a warning and a beacon at the same time. Families who never met Morgan have been helped because she was taken. Children who never heard her story may have been protected because her mother refused to let the case disappear. Yet none of that changes the original wound. Legacy is not the same as justice. Public impact is not the same as getting your child back. A state can rename an alert system, and a foundation can save lives, and a mother can hold other families together and still go home to the same unanswered question every night. That contradiction is part of what gives the case its emotional power. Morgan's story is not just a mystery. It is also a study in what prolonged uncertainty does to identity. A child becomes an age progression. A mother becomes an advocate. A family becomes a symbol. A town becomes a place known for one terrible night. That transformation can preserve a case, but it can also flatten it if people are not careful. Morgan was not born to become a foundation or an alert system. She was a child at a ball game. The public meaning of her name came later because something irreversible was done to her. It is also worth remembering that child abduction cases often create folklore around themselves. Over decades, small details harden into certainty even when they were never firmly established. People repeat phrases like creepy man, or suspicious truck, or she was only gone for a second until the words feel less like witness material and more like mythology. Morgan's case has some of that risk because the story has circulated for so long and because its central image is so potent. That is why it matters to return to the documented facts and to separate them from dramatic retellings. Yes, there were witnesses who saw a man and a truck. Yes, Morgan was last seen near her mother's car. Yes, the timeline was frighteningly short. But there are also limits to what the public can know about exactly how she was taken. Those limits matter because they remind us that the case is not solved in narrative terms even now. At the same time, there are details that persist because they are supported repeatedly across official and family sources. The green Girl Scout shirt, the silver caps, the time around 10:45 at night, the baseball field in Alma, the red pickup with the white camper shell, the man watching the child, the truck disappearing at about the same time Morgan did. These are not decorative details. They are the fixed points of a case otherwise defined by disappearance. They are the coordinates around which 3 decades of searching have revolved. And perhaps that is what makes Morgan's case feel so severe. Not that the facts are overly complicated, but that they are so simple. A child, a field, a truck, a man, a few minutes, then 30 years. Cases built from simple facts can become impossible because there is so little to hide behind. There is no labyrinth of suspects, no sprawling conspiracy, no maze of digital records and conflicting phone pings and dozens of known enemies. There is only the basic truth that a child left a safe place for what should have been a harmless moment and never came back. That kind of truth does not get less painful with age. It becomes darker as the years passed. Investigators kept working the case. Public information shows searches and renewed efforts over time and countless tips that had to be evaluated. The reality of a cold case investigations is less cinematic than people imagine. It is not one long suspenseful chase. It is patient repetitive revisiting. Old property searches, old interviews, old vehicles, old names. New technology applied to evidence gathered decades before. The work often feels like trying to speak to the past in a language it did not yet understand. Morgan's case would eventually prove exactly how important that can be. For years, the truck existed in the case almost like a dark outline. It was there from the beginning. Witnesses noticed it. Investigators cared about it. The public remembered it. But an outline is not the same as proof. A vehicle can haunt an investigation for decades without ever delivering the one thing detectives truly need. Something inside it, something on it, something that connects the machine not just to the scene but to the child. That is part of why the later forensic developments in Morgan's case were so significant. They did not come out of nowhere. They emerged from the stubborn survival of an old lead that never quite went away. In 2021, the FBI publicly asked for information about Billy Jack Lincks. In that release, the Bureau said that about 2 months after Morgan disappeared, Lincks attempted to abduct a young girl in Van Buren, about 8 miles from the Wofford baseball field where Morgan had last been seen. The FBI also made clear that investigators wanted information about his life from anyone who knew him through work, school, church, or social activity. That kind of public request tells you something important. By that point, investigators believed Lincks belonged inside the core circle of serious attention. Even then, he was not publicly named as the confirmed man who took Morgan. He was a person of interest. That distinction matters. Law enforcement language can seem cautious to the point of frustration, but each term has a reason. A person of interest is not a charge. It is not even necessarily a suspect in the final sense. It is an acknowledgement that a person may hold relevance that investigators cannot ignore. In a long, cold case, that kind of step can be both significant and maddening. It points in a direction without fully arriving. The direction in Morgan's case was difficult to overlook. According to the FBI, Lincks attempted to abduct another young girl roughly 2 months after Morgan vanished, and did so not far from the same ball field. Public reporting around the case has described the truck involved in that later incident as resembling the vehicle linked to Morgan's disappearance. That pattern is what gave the old lead moral force long before science gave it forensic force. Even without the later DNA work, many people looking at the case saw the basic shape of a frightening possibility. A man with access to a similar truck, a later attempted child abduction, a location close to the original scene, a violent opportunity almost too close in time and geography to ignore. But suspicion and proof are not the same thing. That is why cold cases often linger, even when one explanation seems to gather weight. Investigators need more than pattern. They need something concrete enough to survive scrutiny. And for a long time, Morgan's case remained suspended between compelling suspicion and incomplete proof. The 2023 Hulu docuseries, Still Missing Morgan, offered the public a look at how investigators had begun revisiting some of the evidence with new attention. ABC News reported that one of the most important clues remained the red pickup truck with the camper that had been parked near the field. The documentary also highlighted physical evidence recovered from the truck after investigators were able to examine it. According to ABC News, initial crime lab work found blood on part of a seat and hair samples, but those items initially did not yield enough DNA information for a match to Morgan. Investigators also found a blue-green cotton fiber in the mat under the seats and in metal parts of the truck. The fiber was analyzed, and investigators said it matched the same type of Girl Scout shirt Morgan had been wearing that night. That was a major development, because fibers do not tell a story on their own, but they can do something quietly powerful. They can anchor possibility. A matched fiber does not describe how a child entered a vehicle. It does not tell us whether she was lured or grabbed or carried. It does not tell us where the vehicle went. But it reduces the size of the world. It makes one scenario more plausible and other scenarios less so. It tells investigators that the truck may not be a rumor sitting beside the case. It may be inside the case. Still, even that was not final. Fibers can be challenged. Transfer can be disputed. Similar materials can exist elsewhere. The story of Morgan's investigation is in part the story of how difficult it is to move from strong indication to definitive linkage. In the world of public storytelling, people often want a single clue that changes everything overnight. Real investigations almost never work like that. They accumulate pressure slowly. A witness, a later crime, a recovered vehicle, fibers, hairs, retesting, new laboratories, better DNA methods, new confidence built on old material. Then, in October 2024, the public case changed in a way it had not changed for nearly 30 years. Alma Police Chief Jeff Pointer announced that Billy Jack Lincks was now considered a suspect in Morgan's disappearance. The reason was not rumor or inference, it was DNA. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported that DNA analysis of a blonde hair taken from Lincks' red truck strongly indicated that Morgan had been in that vehicle. AP reported that hair found in the truck matched Morgan's family line, and that none of her relatives knew Lincks or had ever been in his truck. That distinction is devastatingly important because it closes off the most convenient, innocent explanations. It suggests that Morgan's biological material did not arrive there through some casual or indirect family contact. It suggests direct connection. At that press conference, Chief Pointer also stressed that the investigation was not over and that many questions remained. That caution was not formality. It was the truth. Naming Lincks as a suspect did not answer the whole case. It answered a crucial part of it. It made the truck no longer just a suspicious object, and made Lincks no longer just a troubling name in the background. But it did not reveal Morgan's final location. It did not tell investigators whether anyone helped him. It did not show what happened after she entered the vehicle. In a normal criminal case, that would be the beginning of an arrest phase. Here, it arrived after the suspect was dead. Lincks had died in prison in 2000. That fact gives the entire development a special kind of bitterness. When a long, cold case suddenly gains definition after the primary suspect is already dead, the family receives knowledge without accountability. The explanation narrows, but justice does not expand. There is no interrogation left to conduct, no trial to prepare for, no chance to force the suspect to answer publicly for what he did. The dead keep their silence, and the living are left with a case that is, at once more solved and still unresolved. Colleen Nick spoke emotionally after the suspect announcement, and the reaction was completely understandable. For years, hope had existed in more than one form. Hope that Morgan might still be alive. Hope that a stranger had made a mistake and left some trace that would one day lead to her. Hope that the man who took her might still face justice. The 2024 DNA announcement answered one portion of that uncertainty while making another portion more painful. It strengthened the case that Morgan had been inside Lincks' truck. It also removed part of the remaining room for a more merciful explanation. Publicly, Colleen said the DNA evidence was heartbreaking because while it clarified one truth, it did not bring Morgan home. There is a cruel paradox in that. Families of missing children often spend years begging for certainty, yet certainty can still arrive as a wound. This was not the kind of breakthrough that reunites. It was the kind that rearranges grief. It transformed the question from who is Morgan into something more focused and more terrible. If Billy Jack Lincks took her, then what did he do next, and where did he leave her, and did anyone else know? Those are the questions the case lives inside now. So, what is the strongest explanation for Morgan Nick's disappearance based on what is publicly documented today? The strongest explanation is stranger abduction by Billy Jack Lincks using the red truck seen near the ball field. That is not a dramatic theory built from internet folklore. It is the line that best fits the public evidence. Witnesses as described a suspicious man watching Morgan while she played and described a red pickup with a white camper shell parked near the field. About 2 months later, Lincks attempted to abduct another young girl in Van Buren, not far from where Morgan vanished. Decades later, investigators examined a truck associated with him and recovered physical evidence. A fiber consistent with the type of Girl Scout shirt Morgan wore was identified in the vehicle. Then, in 2024, DNA analysis on a blonde hair from that truck strongly indicated Morgan had been inside it. Taken together, those elements do not prove every detail of the crime, but they do create the most coherent public explanation by far. It explains the speed of the disappearance. A truck near the field solves the time problem. A practiced offender with a vehicle can exploit seconds in a way that feels impossible to bystanders. It explains why Morgan was not found nearby. It explains why no extended wandering trail has ever publicly emerged from the immediate area. It explains why the case always felt more like abduction than accident. And it explains why investigators never truly let go of the witness description of the vehicle. It also fits one of the darkest patterns in criminal behavior. Child abductors who act opportunistically often do not need elaborate planning in the way people imagine. They need proximity. They need a child momentarily outside direct supervision. They need a setting where their presence will not instantly trigger alarm. A public ball field provides all of that. It is the sort of place where an adult man in a vehicle may look unremarkable for just long enough. If the offender had already been circling such environments or thinking in that direction, then the crime may have unfolded in a horrifyingly short burst of decision and action. But even the strongest explanation has limits. It does not tell us exactly what Lincks said or did in those final seconds. It does not tell us whether Morgan resisted in a visible way or whether she was deceived. It does not tell us where he drove first. It does not tell us whether she survived beyond the immediate abduction. It does not tell us whether there were other offenses never connected to him. It does not tell us if he acted alone in every part of the crime. And crucially, it does not tell us where Morgan is. That last limit is why the case still remains open, despite the suspect announcement. Investigators do not only want to know who likely took Morgan, they want to know the full event, the route, the aftermath, the disposal or concealment site if Morgan was killed. Any witness who saw Lincks that night and did not realize the significance. Any relative, friend, or acquaintance who noticed something unusual in his behavior after June 9, 1995. Cold case work often becomes less about discovering a brand new theory and more about forcing old silence into relevance. Could the witnesses have been mistaken about the truck or the man? In theory, yes. Witnesses can be wrong. Public events are messy. Children and adults remember different things. Memory degrades, but the 2024 DNA development changes the weight of that objection. Once Morgan's DNA is strongly indicated inside the truck tied to Lincks, the witness material no longer stands alone. It no longer has to bear the whole case by itself. Instead, it aligns with physical evidence recovered years later. That does not make every remembered detail perfect. It makes the larger direction far more credible. Could someone else have taken Morgan and her DNA somehow ended up in Lincks' truck later? Publicly, that scenario has no persuasive foundation. It is technically imaginable in the abstract because almost anything is imaginable when a child remains missing and the full chain of events is unknown. But it is not the kind of explanation investigators build serious cases on. To replace Lincks as the strongest explanation, you would need not just doubt, but an alternative scenario that better explains the witness reports, the later attempted abduction, the truck evidence, and the DNA result. Publicly, no such scenario has been presented. What about the idea that Morgan wandered away and met harm unrelated to abduction? That has always been one of the weakest explanations. not because it is impossible for children to wander, but because the documented context cuts against it. Morgan was last in a populated public environment near her mother's car. The time window was tiny. Witnesses described a suspicious man and vehicle. The later investigative focus on that truck and the eventual DNA result point hard in the direction of abduction. A wandering accident theory asks us to ignore almost everything distinctive about the case. Another possibility that sometimes emerges in public discussion is that Lincks may have had help, or that more than one person knows what happened. Investigators themselves have left room for unanswered questions and have continued asking for information from anyone who knew him. That is not proof of an accomplice. It is recognition that crimes do not occur in social vacuum. Even if Lincks acted alone in taking Morgan, others may have known his habits, his routes, his properties, his associates, or his behavior after the fact. In older cases, secondary knowledge can matter almost as much as primary guilt. One person may carry out the crime, but many people may hold fragments that become meaningful only later. This is the point where disciplined storytelling matters. It would be easy to turn those unanswered questions into a maze of conspiratorial possibilities. That would be a mistake. The most honest reading of Morgan's case is not that it opens endlessly outward. It is that it narrows inward around one suspect while still withholding the final chapter. The range of plausible explanation has become smaller, not larger. That is why it feels different now than it did 10 years ago. The mystery is no longer chiefly who might have taken Morgan. It is how much of the rest of the truth can still be recovered after the probable abductor died without speaking. And that may be the most frustrating part of all. Cases like this can move from total uncertainty to partial certainty and still leave the family with the hardest piece missing. Knowing that Morgan was very likely in that truck does not tell us what happened after the door shut. It does not tell us whether she cried out. It does not tell us whether anyone saw that truck on a road after leaving the field. It does not tell us whether there was a location associated with Lincks that was never searched, or searched too late, or searched without the benefit of what investigators know now. A suspect can be named, and a crime can still feel unfinished. That unfinished quality is what makes Morgan's story different from a solved case, and different from a pure enigma. It sits between them. There is enough evidence now to make the central mechanism of the abduction tragically clear. There is not enough to close the case in the way families dream about. For investigators, that is both progress and torment. For the public, it is a reminder that not all answers arrive in one piece. Sometimes the truth comes in fragments. Sometimes one fragment points with terrible force toward the person responsible. And sometimes even then, the most human question remains beyond reach. Where did he take her? To understand why Morgan's disappearance still feels so impossible, it helps to slow the timeline down almost to the point of discomfort. A baseball game is ending. Adults are gathering purses, jackets, drinks, blankets, and folding chairs. Children are moving with that wild last burst of energy that appears whenever they sense the formal part of the evening is almost over. The field lights flatten the space. Some areas look bright. Others fall into softer dark around parked cars and beyond the edges of the main action. People are not leaving all at once. They are transitioning. And transition is where attention weakens. That transition is the real setting of the crime, not the game itself, and not the deep night after everyone left. The in-between. The moment when no single person is fully responsible for scanning the whole scene, because everybody assumes the scene is still safe. A child can disappear more easily in that interval than in either of the moments around it. During the game, eyes are fixed and routines are clear. After the crowd fully breaks up, the absence would be noticed faster. It is in the drifting end, when a predator has room to operate. Morgan and the other children had been catching fireflies. Public sources describe her last known location as near her mother's car, where she had stopped to empty sand from her shoes. That detail does something more than make the scene vivid. It places Morgan in a posture of vulnerability, bent slightly down, focused on her shoes, briefly less aware of who might be watching. A child in that position is easier to approach without causing alarm. It is easier to speak to her from near a vehicle, or from just outside the range of more focused adult attention. It is easier to make the interaction look routine. The documented witness account that a man was watching Morgan while she played is one of the most chilling pieces of the case because it suggests predatory attention rather than random chaos. If that observation is accurate, then the abduction did not begin the moment Morgan disappeared. It began earlier when she became the focus of an adult stranger's interest. That distinction matters. It means the crime may have unfolded in stages invisible to everyone else. Watching, waiting, measuring the flow of the game, noticing which children moved freely, noticing where parents sat, noticing when the evening loosened enough to create an opening. Predators often rely less on force than on timing. The public imagination tends to picture child abduction as a loud, dramatic event. In reality, a skilled offender may count on confusion and compliance. Many children are socialized to respond to adults. Many do not instantly recognize danger if the approach is calm. The abductor does not need to create a scene, he needs to avoid one. He needs to move the child from one environment to another before the child fully understands what is happening, and before anyone else understands that the movement is abnormal. That possibility can explain one of the enduring questions in Morgan's case. Why no clear scream? Why no single witness reporting an obvious struggle? We do not know that Morgan did not cry out. We only know that no public account has produced a decisive witness to such a moment. In a noisy transitional environment, even a brief protest can be missed or misread. A child saying no or crying might sound like ordinary distress if people do not know they are hearing a crime. And if the approach involved deception rather than immediate force, then the critical seconds may have passed before Morgan herself understood the danger. The truck matters again here. Vehicles extend the offender's control. They shorten the distance between public and private space. The moment a child crosses that threshold, the crime changes. The outside world disappears. Witnesses lose line of sight. Noise is contained. Escape becomes far harder. For investigators, the truck is not just transport. It is the mobile crime scene that may have held the only decisive physical record of what happened after Morgan was no longer visible. This is why the later forensic work on the truck feels so heavy. It turns an old witness image into something almost tactile. You can suddenly picture the interior not as generic upholstery, but as a place where Morgan had likely been. A floor mat, a seat, metal components, hair, fiber. The ordinary surfaces of a vehicle becoming repositories of buried truth. There is something uniquely upsetting about that kind of evidence because it collapses distance. It forces the case out of abstraction and into a confined physical space. Morgan was not merely lost to the night in some vague way. She was likely inside that truck. Once you accept that possibility, the whole case changes shape emotionally. The ball field no longer feels like the place where Morgan disappeared. It feels like the place where she was intercepted. The real terror moves into the unknown drive that followed. Every road out of Alma becomes part of the nightmare. Every dark route available in 1995 becomes a map of speculation. North or south, state line or back road, familiar property or random turn. A child still close enough to home that her mother was probably still calling her name while the vehicle carrying her was already beyond the perimeter of the search. That image is almost unbearable, and yet it is exactly where the case now points most strongly.
It also explains why the search that night could never fully catch up. Once the abduction is framed as a rapid vehicle removal, the first hours become a race already partially lost. Searchers can flood the field and the nearby areas. Officers can question witnesses and look for immediate clues, but the crucial movement may already be happening somewhere else. The abductor's advantage lies in creating uncertainty at the origin point while increasing distance elsewhere. Even a short delay in understanding what occurred can widen the geographic problem enormously. This is one reason the history of missing on child's response in the United States matters in the background of Morgan's case. In the mid-1990s, investigators did not have the same instant public alert infrastructure that later became standard. Arkansas would eventually build a child alert system carrying Morgan's name. That legacy is powerful, but on the night she vanished, there was no magic network capable of freezing the region in place. Even in modern cases, such systems depend on accurate vehicle information and rapid threshold decisions. In 1995, the information environment was slower and more fragmented. Every minute mattered, and minutes were exactly what the abductor used. None of this proves the exact mechanics of the crime. That remains unknown. But it does explain why the abduction could happen in a place so public without immediately producing the sort of evidence people instinctively expect. Public safety is not a wall, it is a feeling, and feelings fail. Morgan's case is the story of that failure, not the failure of her mother, not the failure of one witness to remember more, but the failure of a whole environment that looked safe enough to lower its guard at the precise moment a predator was waiting for it to do so. Long cases gather layers. Some of those layers are useful. Some are noise. Some are scars left by false hope. Morgan's case accumulated all three. Any disappearance that stays active for years attracts reported sightings. The Morgan Nick Foundation has said there have been numerous possible sightings across the United States. That is common in high-profile child cases, and it creates a difficult tension. On one hand, sighting reports cannot be ignored because occasionally they do matter. On the other hand, they can become an emotional trap for families and a drain on investigative resources. A child with a widely circulated face, and later with age progressions, can seem familiar to people in thousands of places. Memory and projection combine. A waitress remembers a customer. A motel clerk remembers a little girl with the wrong adult. A neighbor remembers a woman whose face vaguely matches an age progression released years later. Most of these reports do not lead anywhere. But to dismiss them carelessly would be to risk missing the impossible. That tension has always hovered around Morgan's case. Her mother publicly held onto the possibility that Morgan N. could still be alive while investigators had to work within the darker, statistical reality of child abduction. The public often struggles to understand how both of those positions can coexist. But they can. For a family, the possibility of survival may be morally necessary, even when the evidence points somewhere else. For investigators, the obligation is to follow evidence wherever it goes. Those are not identical forms of hope. They are different ways of enduring the same void. Over the years, public interest in Morgan's disappearance rose and fell, but it never truly vanished. That was due partly to the power of the original story and partly to Colleen Nick's refusal to allow the case to become just another fading file. Media coverage kept returning. Law enforcement kept receiving tips. New technologies opened old evidence again. From the outside, that can look like progress in a smooth line. In reality, long investigations are usually more jagged. The same names reappear. The same objects are reconsidered. Old search areas are revisited with improved methods, or because one new tip suddenly makes an old place relevant again. This is one of the hardest realities to communicate in a documentary about an unsolved case. Viewers often crave the elegance of a breakthrough. They want the story to move from event to clue to revelation in clean steps. Morgan's case does not really behave that way. It behaves like real trauma. It circles. It stalls. It returns to the same fixed images and asks whether time has changed their meaning. Sometimes it has, often it has not. The red truck remained important for years before it became more than symbol. The name Billy Jack Lincks surfaced before he was publicly elevated to suspect. The truth did not arrive all at once. It gathered. And because it gathered so slowly, a lot of weak material accumulated around the stronger facts. That is why honesty matters here. Morgan's case is compelling enough without embellishment. It does not need every rumor repeated as though it were evidence. It does not need dramatic speculation about traffic snaps or shadowy conspiracies or hidden nationwide rings, unless there is real investigative basis for them. Publicly, the strongest line remains much narrower and much more chilling. A local opportunity, a predator with a truck, a child taken from a ball field, a later attempted abduction by the same man. Decades-old evidence finally yielding a stronger answer. There is a tendency, in famous cases, to mistake breadth for depth. People think the more possible theories they pile onto a disappearance, the more seriously they are taking it. In fact, the opposite is often true. Discipline honors the victim more than noise. Morgan deserves a narrative built from what can be supported, and what can be supported already tells a devastating story. That story also reveals something uncomfortable about how memory works in communities. Alma is not a giant anonymous city where a case can vanish into statistical background. It is a place where names and locations hold social weight. People remember where they were. They remember hearing about the abduction. They remember checking on their own children differently afterward. Cases like Morgan's do not only haunt families, they alter a town's internal map. One ball field becomes more than a ball field. One stretch of summer becomes a before and after in local memory. Over 3 decades, that kind of community memory can become both help and obstacle. Help because people keep talking, and sometimes old conversations lead to new tips. Obstacle because repeated retelling can also harden assumptions and distort nuance. That is another reason the 2024 DNA development mattered. It replaced some of the community folklore with something more objective, not total certainty, but enough scientific weight to stabilize the narrative around a stronger core. Still, even science does not erase every weakness in a case like this. The condition of old evidence matters. Chain of custody matters. The precision of public statements matters. When officials say a lab report strongly indicates that Morgan had been in the truck, they are making a claim with major emotional force, but also with careful wording. It is not the same as a full courtroom exposition of every test result. Investigators are often reluctant to release all technical details because the case remains active, and because they may still need to protect integrity of evidence or the possibility of future prosecution against another party if one exists. That means the public receives enough to understand the significance, but not enough to settle every question. And that uncertainty can be frustrating. It can make people overread what has been said or underread it. Some will say the case is solved now and only burial details remain. Others will say nothing counts until a body is found. Both positions are too simple. The case has clearly moved. It has not fully closed. A major component now has strong evidentiary support. The final chapter still does not, if anything. That combination makes Morgan's disappearance more haunting now than when it was just an old mystery. Before the forensic developments, the case belonged partly to the realm of unresolved possibility. After them, it belongs more to the realm of unfinished truth. And unfinished truth can be even harder to live with, because it shows the outline of what happened without giving the one thing the family still needs: Morgan herself. There is another reason this case stays with people, and it has nothing to do with forensics. It has to do with scale. When adults disappear, the public mind often fills the gap with stories about choice. Maybe they ran, maybe they left, maybe they were hiding something, maybe the last known sighting was more voluntary than it looked. Those assumptions can be unfair and wrong, but they exist. Morgan was 6. There is no moral ambiguity to hide behind in the disappearance of a 6-year-old child from a baseball game. The case is stripped down to innocence and intrusion. That simplicity is part of its force. A 6-year-old understands the world through closeness, parents nearby, friends nearby, familiar voices. The idea that such a child could be taken from that world in minutes without leaving a clear trail is terrifying, because it feels like an attack not only on one family, but on a whole social contract. Public spaces are supposed to be safer than isolated ones. Family outings are supposed to be safer than unknown roads. Community events are supposed to be safer than private encounters with strangers. Morgan's disappearance violated all of that at once. That is why the image of fireflies matters so much. It is not just a pretty detail repeated for dramatic effect. It is a clue to the emotional geometry of the night. Fireflies belong to a child's idea of summer. They belong to the kind of memory adults are supposed to look back on with warmth. In this case, they became the last innocent thing in the timeline. Morgan did not walk away from her mother into danger, because she understood danger. She walked into the space between childhood wonder and adult predation. That contrast gives the case an almost unbearable emotional charge. Cases with strong visual anchors often endure longer in public consciousness. Morgan's has several: the green Girl Scout shirt, the silver caps on her teeth, the red truck with the white camper, the composite of the bearded man, age progression images released over time, the photographs of Colleen holding posters year after year. Each one fixes the case in a way that raw text never could. Viewers do not only remember Morgan as a name, they remember her as a child with a specific face in a specific outfit on a specific summer night. They remember the truck not just as a vehicle, but as the object that was always there in the background, waiting for science to catch up. That may be why the 2024 development landed so hard. It did not introduce a new object. It reanimated an old one. The truck had haunted the case for decades. Then suddenly it became even more intimate. Not just the vehicle seen near the field, but the vehicle containing evidence that strongly indicated Morgan herself had been inside. That shift turns an external clue into an internal one. The child and the object meet. For the public, it changes the emotional texture from speculation to confrontation, and yet even that confrontation leaves open some of the most brutal unknowns. Was Morgan taken somewhere close that night or moved far away? Did Lincks act with impulse? Or did he already know routes, places, and methods that would make detection difficult? Did anyone see him later that night and never realize its importance? Could he have kept trophies or notes or habits that only people close to him would remember? Did he offend in ways never fully documented? These are the questions that keep investigators asking for information about his life, rather than only about the single night of the abduction. In cold cases, biography can become evidence. Who was Billy Jack Lincks in the social world around him? Not in the sense of rumor or lurid storytelling, but in the practical sense investigators care about. Where did he go? Whom did he know? What properties did he have access to? What routines did he follow? What was unusual after June 9, 1995? Did anyone notice him cleaning a truck or changing behavior or avoiding certain places? Did anyone hear him talk about the case? Did anyone know he had an unhealthy interest in children and dismiss it because they never imagined where it could lead? These are not sensational questions. They are the ordinary hidden architecture of cold case resolution. People often assume that once a suspect is dead, the rest is simply impossible. Sometimes it is, but not always. The dead leave traces in the lives of the living. Friends remember, family members reassess old discomfort, coworkers recall remarks that felt off even at the time. Land records, vehicle histories, and property access patterns can still be examined. Search areas can still be prioritized if enough context emerges. That is why law enforcement continued emphasizing that the case was not over after naming Lincks. They were not protecting a dramatic mystery. They were acknowledging that partial truth can still lead to final discovery. There is also the hard fact that many offenders are only partially visible during their lifetimes. A later attempted abduction or sex offense may be the only officially recorded event but not the only harmful act. Publicly available information says Lincks had prior criminal history involving child sexual abuse allegations before the later attempted abduction that brought more attention to him. Even so, the public record around any offender is rarely a complete record of his behavior. Some victims never report. Some incidents do not produce charges. Some complaints vanish into local memory. That incompleteness matters, because it reminds us that Morgan's case may intersect with a larger shadow we still do not fully understand. At the same time, restraint is essential. The goal is not to build a monstrous mythology around Lincks. The goal is to recognize how a predator can remain partially hidden in plain sight, and how older cases often have to reconstruct that hidden life from fragments. Overstating what is known would not honor Morgan. Staying precise does. And precision leads us back to one unsettling conclusion. The known evidence now makes it far more likely that Morgan's disappearance was not a mysterious vanishing in the abstract. It was an abduction tied to a man whose truck was there, and whose later behavior fit the pattern of danger. That makes the case at once more understandable and more tragic. The unknown has shrunk, the horror has not. A lot of unsolved cases survive because they can be endlessly theorized. Morgan survives for almost the opposite reason. It resists decorative theory. The more honestly you study it, the more it contracts around a small set of terrible facts. A child was at a ball game with her mother. She played with friends near the end of the night. She was last seen by her mother's car. Witnesses noticed a man watching her and a red pickup with a white camper shell nearby. The child vanished in minutes. The truck disappeared at about the same time. A man later linked to a similar truck attempted to abduct another girl nearby. Decades later, evidence from his truck strongly indicated Morgan had been in it. He died before he could ever be held publicly accountable. Morgan was never found. That is the spine of the case. Everything else branches off it, and because the spine is so direct, it forces us to sit with one of the most disturbing truths in criminal investigation. Some crimes are simple in execution and devastating in consequence. There is no need for elaborate planning or movie-style complexity. One motivated offender with a vehicle and a willingness to target a child can alter dozens of lives in less time than it takes for a game to end and a family to gather their things. That is the unbearable banality at the heart of Morgan's case. The event was monstrous. The mechanics may have been brutally plain. This is also why the case has such high documentary power. It contains not only mystery but contrast, childhood and predation, community and vulnerability, public space and unseen danger, 30 years of searching against a few minutes of action. A mother who turned grief into advocacy against a suspect who died without answering for anything. A truck remembered from the first day, finally yielding evidence after decades of silence. All of those contrasts keep the story alive because they create motion even when the central absence remains fixed. For investigators, and for anyone trying to tell the story responsibly, there is a challenge here. The case can easily be pushed too far in either direction. Some tellings flatten it into a pure emotional tragedy and lose the evidentiary structure that makes it so compelling. Others turn it into a procedural puzzle and lose the child at its center. The truth is that Morgan's case demands both. It requires the discipline of evidence and the emotional honesty to say what that evidence means. Not in abstract terms, but in human ones. It means that a 6-year-old who trusted the ordinary shape of an evening likely entered a vehicle she should never have entered. It means that her mother's memory of the last glance has had to carry the weight of a lifetime. It means that the strongest answer arrived only after the likely offender was beyond punishment. It means that all the civic good built in Morgan's name exists alongside the unbearable fact that she still has not been brought home. There is also a broader reason the case remains important. It reshaped missing child awareness at a moment when many families were beginning to confront how quickly abduction could occur in ordinary public settings. Some cases change policy because of what happened. Morgan's did. The Morgan Nick Alert system in Arkansas stands as proof, but policy change can create a strange double memory. People remember the alert, they remember the foundation, they remember the advocacy. Over time, they may forget the exact shape of the crime that made those responses necessary. Returning to the specifics matters because public memory has a way of turning victims into symbols and symbols into shorthand. Morgan should not become shorthand. She should remain particular, a specific child on a specific night in a specific shirt at a specific place. That particularity is what resists numbness. It keeps the case from dissolving into genre. And if there is one part of Morgan's story that most resists numbness, it may be the scene at the center of it. Children catching fireflies while adults watch the end of a baseball game. There is something almost painfully American about that scene. It is local and seasonal and communal. It is built from trust. The abduction did not steal a child from her family. It poisoned a form of ordinary memory for countless parents who heard the story afterward. Many of them likely watched their own children differently after Morgan disappeared. Many likely understood for the first time that danger does not always announce itself by looking out of place. A man parked near a field can look like a man parked near a field. A conversation can look like a conversation. A truck leaving can look like a truck leaving. That is what makes the crime so frightening. Not that it violated a clearly dangerous scene, but that it moved invisibly through a normal one. The strongest mysteries are not always the most elaborate. Sometimes they are the ones where you can see almost everything except the moment that matters most. Morgan's case is like that. We can see the field. We can see the children, we can see the truck in outline. We can see the years of searching. We can even now see the probable shape of the abductor more clearly than before. But the central act itself remains just beyond sight. That gap is where the pain lives. That gap is also why the case has endured. There is a version of this story that can only be told through the passage of time. In 1995, Morgan was a child in a green shirt at a ball field. In the years after, she became a missing poster, then an age progression, then a face imagined at 13, at 18, at 25, and beyond. Meanwhile, the adults who knew her had to keep carrying a child version of Morgan in their minds, while the public visuals kept aging her forward. That split is one of the cruelest parts of any long-term missing child case. The family remembers voice gestures, habits, and small living things that never make it onto a poster. The world sees a sequence of forensic portraits trying to guess the face time would have built. For Colleen Nick, that passage of time did not produce silence. It produced a public life organized around absence. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has noted that she became a longtime advocate and helped build support systems for other families. The Morgan Nick Foundation describes its work as support, prevention, and education. It is difficult to overstate what that means emotionally. She did not simply survive what happened. She converted survival into service. Families who entered the nightmare later found someone who already knew its language, and that gives the story a second narrative line that runs parallel to the crime itself. One line follows the missing child. The other follows the mother who refused to let the country forget. Those lines never meet again in the way they should have. But together they explain why Morgan's name still carries such force. This is not only because the case is haunting, it is because the family never allowed the public to reduce Morgan to a closed chapter. That kind of advocacy can sometimes create a false impression that the family has reached some stable meaning from the loss. People admire the foundation and the strength and the years of public work, and may imagine that purpose eventually softens grief. Maybe it offers shape. It does not erase the original fact. Every interview, every anniversary, every alert system bearing Morgan's name exists because a 6-year-old was taken and never returned. The public good is real. So is the wound that created it. 30 years is an almost impossible length of time to imagine in relation to one summer night. Children who were not even when Morgan vanished have since grown up, had children of their own, and brought them to ball fields just like the one in Alma. Detectives have retired. Technologies have transformed entire categories of investigation. The country itself has changed in how it thinks about missing children. Yet Morgan's case remains active. That alone says something important. Cases do not stay open this long by inertia if investigators believe there is nothing left to find. They stay open because evidence and unanswered questions still hold promise. The 2024 suspect development reinforces that promise, but also sharpens the clock. Time is no longer just the enemy of memory, it is also the condition of evidence. Every year that passes after a suspect dies removes possibilities for direct accountability and also complicates the search for Morgan's remains if they are still recoverable. Landscapes change. Properties change ownership. People who once knew something may die or lose memory or convince themselves that what they noticed never mattered. This is why public appeals continue. They are not symbolic. They are attempts to outrun forgetting, and forgetting is perhaps the vodveri in every old disappearance case source. Not only individual forgetting, but social forgetting. The way a case becomes familiar, and then because it is familiar, stops shocking people. Morgan's story resists that more than most because the central image is so enduring, and because the later evidence pulled the case back into focus. But resistance is not immunity. It still requires retelling. It still requires a public willing to hear it, not as folklore, but as an active investigation with active emotional consequences. There is another layer here too. Morgan disappeared before the modern internet turned every case into a permanent real-time archive of speculation. That means a lot of the original case unfolded in a different information culture. Posters, TV segments, tip lines, newspaper stories, community memory. Then later the digital age arrived and carried the case forward into new forms. By the time the 2023 docuseries and the 2024 DNA announcement reached the public, Morgan's story had crossed multiple eras of media and investigation. Few cases survived that transition with their emotional core intact. This one did because the core never stopped being painfully simple. A child vanished in minutes. Her mother never stopped looking. When you strip everything else away, that is still the center of the story. And it may be why Morgan's case feels less like an old file and more like a standing wound in American missing child history. It is not just unsolved, it is unfinished in public. Each new development does not replace the past, it reopens it. The 2024 announcement did exactly that. Suddenly, people who had carried the story for decades had to hear it differently. The truck was no longer just probable, it was evidentiary. The suspect was no longer just plausible, he was named. Hope did not disappear, it changed shape. For some, that made the case feel closer to resolution. For others, it made the loss far more final. Both reactions make sense because both are forms of grief. One grieves the years without answers. The other grieves the answer that arrives too late. At the heart of every enduring disappearance, there is usually one question that the public asks again and again in different forms. In Morgan's case, that question is not only who took her, because the answer to that has narrowed sharply. The question is how a child can vanish so completely from such an ordinary place that even 30 years of attention cannot bring her back. Part of the answer is that ordinary places produce extraordinary blind spots. We trust familiar scenes precisely because they are familiar. A rural or small-town ball field does not trigger the same defensive attention people might bring to a dangerous neighborhood or an isolated roadside stop. Adults relax into social expectation. Children absorb that relaxation and move through it. Predators understand this. They look for moments when the environment itself will help hide them. Morgan's case is not just about one offender. It is also about the ecology of assumption that made his act possible. Another part of the answer is that child abduction is a crime built around irreversible speed. Once the child is in the vehicle, the investigation begins at a terrible disadvantage. Searchers are still concentrating around the origin point while the offender is expanding the radius. The victim's entire world contracts to the interior of a moving truck, while the geographic problem for law enforcement widens with every mile. By the time witnesses are fully interviewed and the seriousness of the situation is communicated outward, the abductor may be somewhere entirely different physically and psychologically. He has already crossed the line from opportunity to aftermath. This does not mean the case was hopeless from the start. It means the first minutes were always likely to determine whether Morgan could be found quickly or disappear into a long investigation. That is a difficult truth, but an important one. There are crimes that can be solved by patient reconstruction after the fact, even when the initial response misses something. Child stranger abduction is often not one of them. The earliest window is everything. Morgan's case demonstrates that in the most brutal possible way, and yet the same case also demonstrates that truth can survive in material ways longer than anyone expects. A hair in an old truck. A fiber trapped where no one noticed it for years. Evidence that remained silent through one era of forensic capability and began to speak in another. That is why the story carries not only terror, but also a kind of grim lesson about persistence. the investigation did not solve itself through luck. It advanced because people kept preserving, asking, revisiting, and testing, because a vehicle was found, because old items still existed, because science changed. Because investigators did not abandon the red truck just because it had not yet yielded a final answer, that persistence matters for another reason. It gives weight to the idea that Morgan can still be found. Not because optimism demands it, because old cases sometimes do reach a final location long after people think the trail is gone. Land changes but not completely. Memory decays but not uniformly. One witness decides to speak. One family member of a dead suspect reconsiders an old story. One property clue suddenly lines up with what investigators now know. None of this is guaranteed. But none of it is fantasy, either. If the case has any remaining chance at a final form of justice, it will probably come from that kind of intersection. Not from a new sensational theory, but from one concrete fact meeting one preserved trace. A route, a place, a statement, a search area that becomes more persuasive once framed by what the truck evidence now suggests. The question is whether that fact still exists in recoverable form. For the family, even that possibility has to live alongside something darker. The stronger the case becomes against Lincks, the more likely it is that Morgan did not survive the crime. Publicly, no official statement has closed that door completely because there is still no recovery and no final account. But emotionally, the 2024 DNA development placed a heavy pressure on hope. It made survival harder to imagine in the simple, undefined way it could once be imagined. That is part of what made Colleen's reaction so heartbreaking. The truth can be clarifying and devastating at the same time. This is why the case still disturbs people who do not normally follow true crime or cold cases. It is not only about mystery, it is about the collision between childhood and the worst kind of adult intent. It is about a mother who looked up and lost the normal future in one movement. It is about a town whose ordinary summer scene became permanent evidence. It is about science arriving late and speaking in the tense of almost. Morgan had been in the truck. Those words do not end the story. They deepen it. Because once you hear them, the old image of the ball field changes forever. You are no longer looking at the place where Morgan simply went missing. You are looking at the threshold where she was taken from the known world into the unknown one. In the end, the reason Morgan Nick's disappearance still feels so haunting is that the case keeps forcing us back to the same unbearable contrast. The scene should have produced safety. The facts produced silence. A small-town baseball game. A mother nearby. Other children present. Witnesses who later remembered a truck and a man, a case with enough visible pieces that it feels as though it should have yielded an answer quickly. And yet the answer did not come quickly. It came in fragments over 30 years, and even now the final piece is missing. That final piece is not technical. It is not legal. It is not even investigative in the narrow sense. It is physical and human. Bring Morgan home. Everything in the case points toward that unresolved need, the witness who saw too little and yet maybe just enough. The truck that lingered in memory until science could speak through it. The mother who transformed her private grief into public protection for others. The decades of age progressions that ask the world to imagine who Morgan might have become. The press conference that named a suspect and still ended with the same question. Where is Morgan Nick? There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to chase the moment of revelation as though revelation itself were closure. This case resists that. The 2024 suspect announcement was it was not closure. It sharpened the truth without completing it. It gave the family a stronger answer to one question and left the deepest one untouched. That is why the case still belongs not to the past tense, but to the present. Morgan is still missing. Her investigation is still active. Her family is still waiting. And so we return to the image that has carried this case for 3 decades. A warm June night in Alma, Arkansas. Fireflies rising in the dark, children laughing at the edge of a little league field, a 6-year-old girl in a green Girl Scout shirt stopping by her mother's car to shake sand from her shoes, a man watching. A red truck close by, then the game ends, the children come back, Morgan does not. Everything that followed was built on that gap: meeches, tips, posters, news reports, age progressions, old suspicions, new science. A named suspect. A state alert system carrying her name. A foundation. A generation of families helped by a mother who never stopped turning loss into action. All of it grows from a few lost minutes on one summer night. That is why the case feels larger than itself. It is a single crime that cast a shadow across decades of American missing child history. But even shadows have centers, and the center here is still one child. Morgan was not a symbol first. She became one because she was stolen from ordinary life. Before the posters and the policy and the advocacy, she was simply a little girl at a baseball game with her mother. That fact should anchor every retelling of this case, because it is what prevents the story from drifting into abstraction. The point is not only that the mystery is compelling. The point is that a child's life was interrupted so completely that the interruption became a permanent part of the world around her. The older this case gets, the more it exposes the strange cruelty of time. Time can erode memory but preserve evidence. Time can soften public attention but sharpen a family's need for answers. Time can kill the probable offender and at the same time uncover the material trace that ties him more closely to the crime. Time can build a foundation in a child's name while leaving that child unfound. In Morgan's case, time has done all of those things. Maybe that is why the story continues to move people who hear it for the first time. It does not ask us to believe anything extraordinary. It asks us to face something terribly ordinary. A predator used an ordinary place and an ordinary lapse in collective attention to do something irreversible. The mystery is not supernatural, it is human. That makes it worse. Because human crimes leave human debts. Someone may still know something about Billy Jack Lincks that has never been properly told. Someone may still remember a route, a property, a habit, a conversation, an absence, from home, a truck, cleaned at the wrong time, a statement that sounded meaningless in 1995 and damning now. Someone may have carried suspicion for years and buried it beneath the assumption that if it mattered, law enforcement would already know. Cases like this are sometimes solved not by discovering a whole new world, but by revisiting one old fact with newly clarified eyes, and that is the position Morgan's case is in today. Not solved in the satisfying sense, not lost in the hopeless sense, clarified but incomplete, narrowed but unfinished, more knowable than before and still deeply unresolved. For her family, the burden of that incompleteness is hard to imagine. For the public, the duty is simpler: to remember the case accurately, to separate evidence from rumor, to understand that the strongest explanation now points toward a named suspect and a truck, but that Morgan herself has not yet been recovered. To resist turning the story into folklore when the real facts are already grave enough, and to keep the central question where it belongs, not how fascinating the mystery is, not how strange the witness recollections feel after all these years, not how advanced the DNA testing became, but where is Morgan Nick? Until that question is answered, the story remains open. The ball field remains a threshold. The truck remains more than a vehicle. The fireflies remain the last innocent image before the night broke. and Morgan remains not a case to be consumed, but a child to be found. Thank you for spending this time with us on SilentEcho. If this investigation stayed with you, please like this video, subscribe to SilentEcho, and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone may remember something that still matters, and stay with us for the next investigation.